Hello, scholars. My name is Dr. Karis Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we looked at motivation and emotion. In this video, we're going to look at personality, so let's get started. So in order to address the subject of personality, we need to first define personality. Personality can be considered patterns or traits in how individuals think, feel, or behave in the long term. After having 3 children of my own, I definitely say that each of my kids has their own distinct personalities. My daughter Sydney is a very determined personality that likes to figure out life's lessons on her own. My son Gabe is perfectionistic, loyal, and extremely helpful. My other son, Galen, is always laughing, going with the flow, and doesn't take life too seriously. Each human being has their own personality, which makes them unique. Let me know what your personality is like in the comments section. Most psychologists believe that an individual's personality is not easy to change. Historians note that the ancient Greeks were the first to study and record aspects of personality. It began with Hippocrates in 370 BC. He believed that human behaviors, traits, and personality were defined by 4 bodily fluids. He stated there was a sanguine temperament, which came from blood, especially from the heart. His second temperament was known as phlegmatic, which came from white phlegm in the lungs. The third was melancholic temperament, which originated from black bile in the kidneys. And finally, choleric temperament, which came from the yellow bile found in the liver. Galen was a physician that took Hippocrates' theories and extended upon them. He said sanguine personality was overall happy, eager, and joyful. A phlegmatic person was reliable, loyal, thoughtful, and peaceful. A melancholy person was unhappy, a bit anxious, and careful with whom they interacted, and a choleric person was bold, took risks, was passionate, and ambitious. In the late 1700s, a man by the name of Franz Gaul said he believed the bumps on a person's skull helped to describe a person's mental abilities, personality, and/or character. He also hypothesized that measurements could help people understand behavioral aspects as well. The skull size could predict if a person was analytical, kind, loyal, friendly, evil, or even prideful. Even though his theories are interesting, they're not very scientific. In the late years, Immanuel Kant described a variety of human characteristics that he believed could be divided into 4 different categories. He did not believe that any of these categories could overlap with one another. Wilhelm Wundt studied his work and added to it by creating 2 major axes: changeable, unchangeable, and emotional and non-emotional. He believed there were strong emotions and weak emotions, as well as certain traits that could be changed and others that could not be changed. Sigmund Freud is the first individual that's credited with the first theory of personality. Freud started out his life after schooling as a medical doctor, but recognized many of his patients' ails were psychological and not physical. When Freud met a patient named Anna O., he noted that she was caring for her ailing father, but as she did so, she started to have hallucinations, amnesia, blurred vision, and headaches. Freud noted that psychological and physical ailments could arise from subconscious problems. He noticed that when he allowed Anna to talk about what was problematic in her life, her physical pains would lessen. Freud eventually called this the talking cure. When Freud attempted to describe his theories to others, he used an iceberg to represent consciousness versus unconsciousness. If only 10% of the iceberg was sticking above the water, this could be considered consciousness. The rest of the iceberg would be considered unconsciousness, 90%, and would be below the water. Freud described how a person's unconscious consisted of desires and urges that a person kept pushed down because it wasn't proper to have those desires at a conscious level. This is what he called repression. Freud believed that at times a person might slip up and say something that would come out of the unconscious, which he termed a Freudian slip. Our personality attempts to balance those conflicting issues. This is when Freud created the id, the ego, and the superego. The id represents a human being's primitive drives or urges and is present at birth. It is in charge of thirst, hunger, and sex. This part of the being seeks pleasure. The superego is created as a child interacts with others and learns the rules of what is right and wrong. It is a consciousness of a person. This part of us tells us how to behave. The superego leads to feelings of pride or feelings of guilt. The ego is the very rational part of the human being. It's what people define as the self. This is what's supposed to balance the ego and the id. The ego allows someone to feel satisfied about themselves and see what's realistic. If the id, the ego, and the superego are not balanced, this can lead to neurosis, which is a tendency to experience negative emotions. If the ego's inability to mediate problems between the id and the superego come about, Freud believed a person would experience anxiety. The ego will try to get balance back by using defense mechanisms, which are supposed to feel protective. Defense mechanisms are defined as protective and unconscious behaviors that aim to reduce a person's anxiety. Often, human beings are unaware that they are using defense mechanisms. Here are some of Freud's defense mechanisms. Denial, not accepting reality because it's unpleasant. After the death of a loved one, we may feel numb and not really allow that person's death to sink in. Displacement is when you transfer behaviors onto a more acceptable and less threatening target. Let's say a male boss has it in for a female worker. Because that female worker can't scream back at her boss and let him have it, she may go home and rip into her husband, who's more safe to be able to do that. Projection. Let's say an individual feels like they don't really own their own grumpiness or don't want to deal with it, and so they notice or state how much they see someone else's grumpiness. Rationalization, stating that certain behaviors you have are there because of other reasons versus those of the truth. Let's say a person says they don't like hugs because they're not a touchy-feely person versus being abused in their childhood and not dealing with that abuse. Reaction formation is when a person accepts the beliefs of someone else in order to reduce their own anxiety. Let's say you hang out with someone who steals and you do so because you see your friend as being discriminated against, and so you begin to steal on their behalf. Regression, going back to coping mechanisms that do not work for your age. Maybe you have temper tantrums or you suck your fingers. Repression, suppressing painful memories and thoughts. Maybe you feel like you've already dealt with all those things, or that you need to deal with them on your own time. Number 8 is sublimation. This means redirecting acceptable desires through socially acceptable terms. Well, if someone else can do them, I can do them too. Psychologists that came after Freud, like Alfred Adler, also helped to extend upon Freud's theories. These individuals are known as NeoFreudian. Adler came up with the idea of the inferiority complex, meaning they don't think of themselves as anything of worth compared to the rest of society. For those individuals that have to continue gaining certain things, this is because of their inferiority complex of their thoughts, behaviors, or emotions. Adler believed in both conscious and unconscious motivations. He also believed that birth order could influence people's personality. There is no scientific validity to the theory of birth order, though. Erik Erikson was another Neo-Freudian who created his 8 psychosocial theories of development. If you're interested in his theory, please see the psychology video about human development. Another Neo-Freudian was Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychiatrist. He called his theories analytical psychology. Jung thought that there was some sort of balance that was needed between the conscious and unconscious thought within one's personality. This balance was something that each individual would have to work on throughout the rest of their lives. One of the most important concepts in his theory was the idea of the collective unconscious. This is where he believed people hold mental patterns and memory traces. He also believed that people had ancestral memories, which he called archetypes, that consisted of universal themes in different cultures. These themes were often expressed in stories and art. Integrating archetypes into one's own life can help to bring about self-realization. Carl Jung also created the idea of introversion and extroversion. An extrovert is considered outgoing and enjoys social experiences. They tend to get energy from being around other people. Introverted people are usually quiet around others and can be careful and reserved. Their energy is derived from spending time alone and working on themselves. Jung thought that a person who had a good balance of both was the healthiest. Julian Rotter was a psychologist that came up with the idea of the locus of control. The locus of control describes how much a person believes they have control over their own lives and their own decisions. A person can have an internal locus of control, which means that they believe they have a majority of control over their own lives and decisions. Having an external locus of control means that a person believes the environment and people around them have control over a person. Gordon Allport was a psychologist that attempted to find words in the English language that could be attributed to human beings. He ended up finding 4,500 words that could be categorized into various traits, including cardinal traits, secondary traits, and central traits. Allport developed a personality assessment test with 16 different factors called the 16PF. The 5-factor model is another example of an instrument about personality. The 5 factors listed are extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. Every person has all 5 factors, but they are along various levels. By taking this assessment, you'll learn more about your own personality. It's important to note that personality is defined and shaped by culture. Culture means all the customs, traditions, rituals, beliefs, and values of a particular society. A person's culture can be seen within their language or the rules they find socially acceptable. Personality psychologists have studied whether or not certain traits are present within different cultures or not. Some traits can be considered universal, while others are very cultural. These traits can be dependent upon whether or not someone belongs to a collectivist culture versus an individualistic culture. The majority of people that are raised in individualistic cultures value personal achievement, sometimes competition, and being free. Those from the US, England, and Australia tend to score highly in these cultural traits. Those individuals that are part of a collectivist culture tend to value respect for others, the needs of the group as a whole, and getting along with others. There are various forms of testing in personality that employment agencies use as well as health industries. Personality tests have been used in criminal cases as well as court battles between fighting parents. Psychology testing can be part of understanding psychological disorders. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, MMPI, was first published in 1943. The second version of it was created in 1989. The second version was created because it was more indicative of a representative population within the U.S. It allowed for standardization on a national level. Most of the time, it takes about 1 to 2 hours for a person to complete. The MMPI-2 is both reliable and valid. The test has measures where if someone is not honest, it will show that they're not telling the truth. These tests can also show whether or not a person is at higher risk for alcoholism. Other tests of personality are called projective testing. Some of these tests have undergone standardization. The Rorschach test, the thematic apperception test, the contemporized themes concerning black test, and TEMAS, T-E-M-A-S, Tell Me a Story, are also part of these projective tests. The Rorschach test was first created and used in 1921 by a man named Hermann Rorschach. These are also known as the ink blot cards. When the therapist asks what the image looks like, this is supposed to reveal unconscious feelings or struggles the individual's having. This test really isn't scientifically reliable or valid, but it can be used to look at depression, anxiety, or psychosis. Thematic apperception test, TAT, was created in the 1930s by Henry Murray and Christina Morgan. Participants are shown 8 to 12 pictures and asked to tell a story about each of the pictures. These stories can reveal hopes, goals, fears, and interests. These can help share unconscious desires and personal details about themselves. It can help look at psychological disorders. Again, reliability and validity are low. The RISB was created around 1950, which has to do with the locus of control. This includes 40 sentences that people are asked to complete as quickly as possible and aren't given much time. They're asked to complete 1 to 2 sentences in length. It can show desires, fears, and struggles. These tests did not do a good job with minority populations, and because of this, alternative tests were created. The contemporized themes concerning Black's test have 20 color images that show African American scenes and lifestyles. These cards help to increase story length, allow clients to feel represented, and feel as though they identify with the test. The TEMAS test is used with Hispanic youth, and its images are for that population. Alright, well this is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please click that like button and don't forget to subscribe. I hope you have an amazing day, and I will talk with you soon.